Welcome to the Road to Zero podcast. I'm your host, Nick LeBlanc, founder of Network Potential Consulting. We're here to explore the fast emerging zero impact economy, which is transforming the way we do business, bringing prosperity and regenerating the natural world in the process. And I invite you to look at how you can position your business at the forefront of this global movement. Today on the Road to Zero, we're talking to Ben Levitt, Director of Research and Development at Zap Energy, joining us from Seattle, Washington.
Hey,
welcome, Ben.
How you doing?
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for I know with the summer it's been fun to try to figure out a schedule that works. I'm glad we finally got to make it work. Yeah, I'd like to hear what got you into the fusion industry.
Good place to start off, and it's been a very circuitous road for sure. I mean, I've been a physicist for my career. I am a physicist, but even as a child, I was really interested in science fiction, and books and movies, and then education-wise, sometimes it really comes down to one or two great teachers. And I grew up in Winnipeg. Went to Kelvin High School, and I had a fantastic grade 10 physics teacher. And, I think that might have made all the difference, just having a really fantastic teacher that got me into this subject and kind of turned me on to something I had no idea about. So, from there, I did my undergrad in Montreal in physics, and I tended towards the area of plasma physics, not necessarily seeking out any environmental solutions or any energy issues that, this was in the 90s. So, of course, I was an environmentalist, but the CO2 issues weren't really on the forefront, at least of my mind. So I wasn't thinking of, nuclear energy or anything like that. But I got my PhD in plasma physics. And plasma physics is the medium for nuclear fusion. And so I was exposed to it, back then, but more in a really academic and researchy type way. I was actually researching the aurora borealis. Growing up in Winnipeg, as a kid, I saw the Northern Lights all the time, and was just really fascinated by what this was. So the research I did then for my PhD was trying to understand this in an experimental setting. So not extremely applied in terms of energy. And then, we won't go through all the circuitous route. I did a little stint in accelerator physics in Geneva at CERN. And but then I went into industry and finally into the energy industry, but not in renewables. So somehow I ended up working for Schlumberger, which is an oil and gas service company, but using nuclear physics. So I built these tools called neutron generators, which uses the fusion of hydrogen to generate neutrons, and you use these neutrons to study matter. And in fact, in the industry, they use this to study geophysical formations to understand what's down there. So we use this on Earth, and we've actually used these devices on other astrophysical bodies. We sent one to Mars, one's going to the moon soon, and actually one is on a trip to a moon of Saturn, Titan, to explore it. But, to cut that short, so that's using nuclear fusion, but not for its energy. That's just for the particles it generates. So finally, fast forward a dozen years, our environmental issues, global warming, CO2, I've been really wanting to get back into fusion, get back to my sort of roots of plasma physics. And again, in the meantime, that industry has really been heating up. There's a lot of effort. There's a lot of companies now in the private sector, not just in the public sector, in universities and national labs, but in the private sector now, where there's a lot of interest. So I've been looking for an in back into that industry over the last few years. And this finally came up for Zap Energy. So I moved and started here last winter, moved from the East Coast. I've been living in Boston for 12 years and moved here to Seattle. That's sort of where I'm at the moment.
And it's really interesting what you say, because I've noticed that too. There seems to be a lot of private investment in nuclear fusion, and quite a few companies. There's actually one here in Vancouver. There's several. So can you give us an insight of what is going on in the industry and what is really like having this industry be heavily invested in and actually moving?
So there's, last count I heard, about 24 startups across the globe, mostly concentrated in the US and in the UK, but also, as you say, there's General Fusion in Vancouver, a couple hours north from me, and one in Australia, and some other scatterings. And these range from, a couple people in an academic lab spinning out from there to larger companies, maybe on the order of 200 people. And this is new. Some of them have been around for a couple of decades, slowly churning away, but the majority of these have arisen in the past few years. And that mirrors the amount of venture capital and private investment that's going into the industry, which is now just past about $2 billion of venture capital. In the first 20 years of the industry, there was a fraction of that. Most of that is in the past few years. So it's definitely accelerating. And clearly, the reason, of course, is climate change and the need to address this very soon, and not just with an energy transition, but really more of an energy revolution. And nuclear fusion, and we'll get into this, could easily be that energy revolution. I think the other reason for that is what's happening with ITER. Now, ITER is this international effort that's being built in the south of France, which is going to be a huge demonstration reactor, like a 2 gigawatt nominally, if it were to become operational and commercial reactor. And there's been a bit of, I guess, a reaction to that because so much of national funding globally has gone into this massive project with its cost overruns and budget overruns, time delays, that's dried up some of the funding from universities. And so a lot of folks have then spun off from universities and looked to private funding to venture out and to field their other ideas, which are usually smaller, more compact, cheaper, quicker to market, because there's, we can't wait. We can't wait for this massive machine to come online in 2040 and 2050. The solution needs to be now. I think finally, one last reason is the model of what's happening in the space sector, where you have this, where it used to be just, in the US would be NASA, but now you have these private companies that have spun off, and there's a real public-private synergy between NASA and SpaceX and Blue Origin and these things. And that's really paid dividends, and that's worked out well. And so I think a lot of investors look to that, and they can see something similar happening in the fusion industry.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's like you give government a lot of money, and it's interesting how long it takes. Like it's a bit of almost looks like a bit of a bloated effort. But yeah, if you look at the SpaceX, how quickly innovation happens when you've got that private model, it seems like that's almost what's playing out now. You have that private industry is getting the money, and they're going quite fast, and they're coming up with different ideas and even different directions, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think, in the energy industry, you have so many other factors at play. I mean, in space, yes, you have people who are, really interested in that, and down the road, there'll be maybe a huge industry. Right now you have, a satellite industry, but we're not, there's no massive money makers, but energy is massive, obviously, trillions of dollars to make an energy. So investors see that investors are also environmentalists. There's a lot of environmental investors who see a need and see an opportunity, and the opportunity is huge. And so getting in early on something that could be a massive game changer like fusion is a real motivation for a lot of these investors to seed some of these startups. A lot of them, aren't expecting necessarily a return on their investment tomorrow. So they're investors that want to put their name down in history and be a part of it. That's similar to the space industry as well. But you have massive, high net worth individuals who see a lot of value, not just in the return on their investment, but just in putting their money behind a solution to, our global problems.
It's really great to see that happening. And can you give us just a quick basics? I know some people are familiar with fusion, some people not so much. What's the big difference between what we know as nuclear fission, what everybody's familiar with, and nuclear fusion?
Yeah, well, again, I'm not even sure everybody is familiar with nuclear fission, but they are nuclear processes, and they have that in common, but that's where the similarity ends. And when we say nuclear now, when anybody says nuclear, that means fission in terms of energy generation. So all nuclear power plants now are using nuclear fission, which is the process whereby you have heavy elements, plutonium, uranium. These things come to mind for the average person, and these elements go unstable and break apart. And as they break apart, they give off energy. They also are quite, cause a radioactive problem. Very long-term issue. Fusion, on the other hand, is the opposite process, where you have light elements, hydrogen and isotopes of hydrogen. An isotope is really another flavor of an element with a different number of neutrons in the nucleus. The names for hydrogen's isotopes are deuterium and tritium. You may have heard of these. And so you have fusion processes where these come together and give off a much bigger amount of energy. They fuse and make a heavier element like helium. And this is the process that runs in the cores of stars. All stars run on nuclear fusion. Fusion has a ton of advantages over fission. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of nuclear fission in general, especially these days when we have a climate issue. Maybe we'll get to that separately, but let me continue on the explanation of fusion here. The differences are a lot. So it's a lot more, it's 4 times more energy comes out in a fusion reaction than in a fission reaction per weight of the fuel. Fuel, like I said, is hydrogen, and its isotopes, which are abundant in seawater. It's not like you have proliferation issues with dual use with weapons. And then on the radioactivity side as well, the problem there is a much less. You don't have the reactants of fission, which are inherently radioactive and have a half-life, tens of thousands of years, and you have to bury it in the ground. The radioactivity, it's not vanished, but it's more on the order of tens to 100 years. And so the scale of it is just much smaller. And so it really could be, an answer to our energy problem today, just in one technology going forward.
Yeah, definitely has a lot of promise. And can you give us an idea of like what approach that Zap Energy is taking? So how do you differentiate what you guys are up to compared to some of the competition or some of the other groups out there?
Yeah, well, and what we haven't said is, how you do this in general. I mean, you might think, well, why haven't we done this already? And it is tricky. It's basically having a star on Earth. And how do you do that? How does a star run? The star runs because it's just so massive. It has all the pressure, the gravitational pressure from all that mass crushing the matter together, creating a pressure that allows those particles to fuse. So we don't do that. We don't have that on Earth, and you can't really just generate that. So you have to use typically magnetic fields. And there's a lot of different approaches to doing that, but you can imagine it's tricky. It's creating a confinement scheme for matter that's as dense and as hot as that it exists on the sun. And so you have to be extremely clever. And efforts on these technologies have been around since the 1950s. Right out of the Manhattan Project and right out of the nuclear weapons program, people started to think about nuclear energy. Nuclear fission came online in the 50s, right afterwards. And then nuclear fusion, people wanted to field as well, and that started right away. So we've been working on it for 70 years, and it's been a long process. And there's lots of different approaches. Magnetic confinement fusion, MCF, is what I've just referred to, where you use magnetic fields. There's something called inertial confinement fusion, or ICF, where you use high-powered lasers to do this. And folks who are listening to the news might have heard a big press release yesterday or 2 days ago out of Lawrence Livermore Labs, where the National Ignition Facility achieved a major result, and that's using lasers, inertial confinement fusion. Those are big, big efforts. And a lot of the startups, those are in national labs. A lot of the startups are using smaller, more modular, cheaper, faster to market approaches, or at least they hope to. And that's what's driven a lot of the investment. So, and there's, a dozen different types of technologies, some of them very similar, using different types of magnetic, bottles. A tokamak is the typical one, where you use sort of this donut-shaped plasma with coils that go around the donut this way as well as this way, and you make this sort of helical path around the donut. That's at least 2 or 3 of the startups are doing that. What Zap Energy is doing is a much simpler scheme. And in fact, it doesn't use any magnets at all, and it doesn't use any lasers at all. It's one of the earliest confinement schemes back in the 50s, called the Z pinch or Z pinch, depending on where you come from. And really, it's just a column of plasma. It's just a linear column of plasma, and you could think of it really simply as a massive, massive spark plug, if you want. And the reason it hadn't panned out back in the 50s, a lot of research went into it then, is that you saw these fusion reactions, you saw this thing happening, but what happened is that the plasma goes unstable. I mean, you can imagine trying to bottle this thing up it doesn't want to, has so much energy that it always finds a way to, the mass, instead of creating this nice plasma column, wants to escape out. And that kind of doomed it. And then other concepts like the tokamak arose, which have better confinement. What Zap Energy has done is found a solution to this. And we don't have to go into the deep physics details, but it's called a sheared flow. So in other words, you have, as the plasma flows along this column, the inner and outer edge of the plasma flow at a different rate. And so it mixes the column, mixes the instabilities, and so in that way stabilizes it. And so we've been able to show incredibly good performance, not yet at a fusion commercial reactor, but enough to really, step out from the university. We've now closed 2 funding rounds, from a Series A and a Series B funding round, and we've hired 30 people now. We're looking to double in the next year to get to a break even, where, in other words, the energy out is equal to the energy in. And we're about a factor, we're not orders of magnitude away, we're about a factor of 3 away in performance from where we are now to where we need to be to a commercial reactor.
What does that look for, like, in the next year or two? What do you see is when you might hit that achievement?
Yeah, really good question. The future is competitive. There are a lot of folks, a lot of our competitors, and best of luck to them, right? I believe in nuclear fusion, and I would love Zap Energy to be the first to get to a break even. But I really want, nuclear fusion writ large to be commercialized, and to have as soon as possible, a path to a carbon-free, abundant energy future for the planet. So good luck to anybody who gets there. And there are a lot of people are stepping up to the plate to try to do this. All of our competitors. So we're going to see a lot, and if you're paying attention to the industry, you see a lot of press releases of really big and great performance from all of these folks. We have a path. We are trying to get to what's called scientific break even in 18 months, so in early 2023. From there, it's another, let me give you some numbers just to give you a scale of where we're at now. So the Z-pinch machine can be thought of pretty much in terms of one parameter, which is the plasma current, the amount of plasma electrical current that's in it. We need to get to something like about a mega amp or more of plasma current to get to a commercial reactor. Your spark plug is, say, a milliamp. So we're 9 orders of magnitude in current higher than that. So it's a massive amount. And what's fantastic about it is that as you put more and more current, what plasma does, if anybody can remember their high school physics, is it generates its own magnetic field. As you move a current, it creates this right-hand rule where it creates a magnetic field around it. And that combination compresses the plasma. So all you have to do is increase the current, keep it stable, which is not a simple feat. And this magnetic field will serve to pinch it, that's why it's called a pinch. So it squeezes the plasma down smaller and smaller until you get to this sub-millimeter, extremely high density matter state where it starts to fuse. So I mentioned this 1 mega amp and higher regime where we need to get to. Right now we're at around 500 kiloamps, so about half of that. So in the next year and a half, we need to double and then triple our current to get to a break even and then a commercially viable product. So we look to the 5-year time scale to prove the technology and then scale it out.
So 5 years to a decade, we could see commercial fusion.
What needs to happen is for us to prove the viability at that current level, to prove that scientifically that those fusion reactions are happening exactly where we predict they are in that regime, in that current regime, to show that we understand it and that it's scaling up, and then we'll be able to ramp up even further to get to the commercial scale facility. And that's when you would start to partner with industry that knows how to do that, whether it's a Bechtel or a GE, people who know how to build nuclear reactors already. So we would have the nuclear fusion core technology, and we would know how to do, the thermal cycle, which I haven't really explained, but a thermal cycle and how you get the fusion energy out. And that's when you can tap into energy industry knowledge and partner with industry. And then you start scaling up really quickly at that point.
Yeah, it sounds like you could take this core and almost swap it out for nuclear core and kind of have that same water technology, steam turbine, and everything associated.
Exactly. The steam turbine and a lot of that industry knowledge is there, and a lot of that, not all of it, certainly. There's a lot of unique things to fission that is totally different in fission, and some of it for the better, right? We don't have the waste to deal with. But yeah, the plan would be to prove the viability of the fusion core, and then the most viable path would be to partner with industry to scale up quickly.
And I hear you're hiring. And I think you just closed a round of funding, which I think even you had. I think Chevron was even investing in what you guys are up to.
Yeah, so that's another interesting aspect to the investment. Like, it's not just venture capital and high net worth individuals. A good chunk of the investment into some of these startups comes from oil and gas. We have Chevron, which is the first American company to invest. One of a larger competitor of ours, Commonwealth Fusion in Boston, which I just moved from. They have ENI, which is an Italian company, oil and gas company, and Equinor, the Norwegian, right? Yeah, company. So there's a lot of interest in oil and gas. I mean, they know that the energy transition is coming. I come from that industry, so I knew about it before I left. I'm part of that energy transition because I moved from there to here. They know all about it, and they need to get ahead of that curve. And part of that is making investments in alternative energies. Fusion is definitely, I would think, one of the bigger gambles they made. I mean, they make investments in geothermal, they make investments in mining and things that are closer to their core competencies. But also, like I say, there's 3, maybe 4 now oil and gas companies that are investing in fusion. And I say it's not necessarily a hedge, but it's seeing the energy transition coming. And there's there are some things in common. I mean, they have a global footprint. They know how to scale. And so there's a lot of know-how that once a nuclear startup proves their core technology, that a large company, say like an oil and gas, could accelerate that very quickly. And that's, I think, what you see happening and starting to happen.
And can you, you mentioned a bit about, talked about fusion and talked about talking in that more detail. And how do you see that playing out? So you see a lot of investment in new fusion, modular reactors, some molten salt reactors. Where do you see that industry going?
So, like I said, I'm glad you bring it back to this. Like I said, I'm a fan of nuclear fission too, and unfortunate the state of the industry now. People and a lot of environmentalists, and count me as one of them. Count me as an environmentalist, but count me as a pro-nuclear environmentalist. I think there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of misunderstanding. Some of it warranted. There's definitely been accidents, but when you weigh the risks of climate change against the risks of nuclear fission, to me, it's just, there's no question out there at all. You're looking at something that has risks for us on the order of, say, tens of thousands of years in terms of the radioactive waste that come from a nuclear fission plant, compared to a risk that is daily now, right? I mean, you look at, forest fires, you look at climate changes accelerating at an exponential rate. Nuclear fission even now provides an answer to that now, right? You look at France that has upwards of 70% energy coming from, carbon-free, coming from nuclear. The US has about 19%, but countries all over the world are shutting down their fission plants, including in places like, Germany and Japan. And in places, they're burning coal. And to me, this is just unbelievable. So I think, when you talk about the energy transition, I wouldn't talk about, natural gas as the energy transition. I would talk about nuclear fission as the technology that you use in the energy transition. And you're transitioning to fusion, because fusion would really take the place of almost all of the above. I still think there's still an energy mix, and that's going to happen for a while throughout this energy transition. And I would hope to see fission and small modular reactors, SMR reactors. I would hope to see that take the place. If the US and Canada don't step up, others will. China and Russia are fielding these technologies, and they'll field them all over the world to Latin America and Africa, and they will be fielded, and that's good for the planet. But it would be better if North American efforts stepped up as well. So that's in the short term. In the slightly longer term, in the order of a decade or two, I really hope that nuclear fusion comes to play. So you don't have to worry about proliferation. You don't have to worry about mining uranium or enriching it, and you don't have to worry about radioactive waste. And you have this abundant fuel, which is hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. There have been calculations that shown that the amount of deuterium in seawater would power the planet for hundreds of millions of years without any other source. And not only that, humanity at some point might step off planet Earth, and nuclear fusion would be the best way to do that, to not only get us to the stars in terms of propulsion, but also once you get there, instead of having to worry about where is your uranium coming from, you have, like I said, hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. It's everywhere. So that's not just my vision. I think that's the vision of many people in the fusion industry.
Yeah, and I really hear that at some point, the fission industry will really kind of transform into the fusion industry. So it sounds like it'll be hard to find a place for fission in a world where nuclear fusion actually works.
Yeah, I think that's likely the case. There's a lot of baggage that the fission industry has, for better or for worse. That's a separate discussion. And social perception is a lot. There's a lot of great technologies that have not come to market just purely because of social perception, not because they weren't a great technology. Whatever the future of fission is, part of our job in the fusion industry is to avoid those pitfalls, to learn from them. And there's a steep curve there that we do have to do. We have to educate public to show them that fusion is really different. The risks are completely different, a lot less, for all the reasons we've already discussed. But not just from the public, but even from like a regulatory point of view. A lot of the roadblocks that fission experiences are coming from regulators that have set up those roadblocks and that are impeding the industry, certainly in North America. So we need to communicate to policymakers and regulators that fusion is different. It shouldn't be regulated the way the fission industry is regulated. Otherwise, it's never going to work. Otherwise, we could prove the physics, we could prove it, we could have this fantastic technology and suffer the same fate. And that would be really unfortunate, is to have this wonderful technology and have it be misunderstood and overly regulated in a way that would prevent it from being fielded rapidly. We need to accelerate it. We need private, the private funding is going to get us off the ground. But ultimately, when you want to go to scale, there's going to have to be huge buy-in from regulators and from governments, whether it's in terms of subsidies or where to site these reactors. So that's something that we're actively doing now. An advocacy group is budding right now and trying to communicate to both to the public and to regulators how we think they should regulate this.
It's really great to have this conversation, because every time I talk to people, it seems there's this idea of what fusion is. Oh, they've been working on it forever. They've been saying it's almost there forever, and a lot of people don't see it as something that's even on their radar. So really, thank you for like exploring this and really showing us this vast industry that's quickly developing. And it's interesting how there's not much media to go with it, except for like very recently. If you know where to look, you can find a little bit of it.
Well, yeah, I guess my head is, if you know where to look. Certainly my feed on LinkedIn is all fusion news, and there's a ton of it, right? Like I said, there's at least 24 startups. ITER is coming online in the next decade. But then you have this big press release, and that was in the New York Times, about the National Ignition Facility in Lawrence Livermore. There are a lot of efforts, not just in the private industry, but again, these much larger efforts. And so from all points, there's this, heating up of the industry and this acceleration of the industry. The science is accelerating and the investment is accelerating. So I think, there's a whole lot of momentum, and it's not an if at this point. It's a matter of when, and the when is compressing down to, small numbers of years, and not the stereotypical 30 years out that everyone always quotes.
Well, thank you for enlightening us and really showing us what's going on the ground. It's a very story worth telling, and really acknowledge the efforts you're putting to really create a really powerful future that will resolve a lot of the problems that we're having now.
Yeah, that's the hope and that's the vision. And yeah, thanks for reaching out to me. It's been great chatting.
Thank you for my guest, and good luck getting back into the work week.
Will do. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today. Check us out at www.futureproof-network.com to hear our other episodes, links to our YouTube channel, and to join our Future Proof Business Network. See you again on our next episode.